much, Paul, for coming and joining us for an interview. We're super, super excited and grateful for that. I'd love for us to start off with just a brief introduction. If you would introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah. My name is Paul Willis. I am a hip hop and spoken word artist. I also do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. I've been based here in Sacramento for the past 10 years, but I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. So a lot of my stories about like my family and, what it was like growing up, all of that stuff is in reference to, what life was like back east. But a lot of the work that I've done as an adult has been here in the Sacramento community in education, nonprofit, social justice spaces, youth development spaces, and all the above. So yeah, there's a bunch of things that I do in the community, from like leadership development training, executive coaching, to working in the juvenile hall. I've released a film earlier this year talking about kind of gentrification and how it's impacting certain communities here in Sacramento. So, there's a lot that I'd like to get into, but I'm excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, so are we. Yes, and that's one of the things that we both, like you sent me the documentary that you're speaking about, and yeah, it was super impactful. That's a huge part of that I personally got out of it was the gentrification aspect. I personally have a bachelor's degree in sociology and public administration, and that's something that I think is a really important topic of conversation that it doesn't get enough life in mainstream, media. It might get like touched on a little bit, but in terms of the effects in the communities that are really going through it and being affected by that, I think it's not really focused on enough as a specific concept. So I really appreciate that documentary. So on the topic of that film, I noticed on, I think it was like a piece of wall art, it said "Rise, Heal, Overcome." And that really stuck out to me. That was kind of at the beginning of the film. And as you've said, a lot of your music, you touch on, the community that you come from and kind of the things that you've been through. So I'm just wondering, what are a few monumental, and I'm sure there's a lot, but just things that stick out in your head, like monumental ways that you've grown through adversity in your life?
Yeah. There have been a bunch of things, I think, kind of starting with even just being born. So I was born in 19, right? My grandmother raised me and most of my brothers and sisters. My mom was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and like has been for decades of her life. There's no father's name on my birth certificate. So being raised in a household and like five kids, it was hard for a lot of reasons. But one of the beautiful things about that too, though, was my grandmother was somebody who, stressed education and stressed kind of giving back to the community, and the community really took care of her and us. So that was one of the things that was really special about growing up, is like, I knew all my neighbors, my grandma, and at a pizza shop. You know what I mean? Just those small things that helped to support our family. So that was really special and really dope. But struggle of like never knowing my dad and not ever having a relationship there, and then seeing my mom struggle throughout the years was something I had to deal with a lot personally. A lot of anger issues when I was younger. Just a lot of unresolved stuff that it took me a while, because I didn't have any language when I was a kid to like name any of it. I couldn't tell you why I was mad, or why I was getting in fights with people, or why I felt bullied, or any of that kind of stuff. But it was important, I think, over time to, really like ask those types of questions, to do that reflection, to go to therapy, the whole nine, to really get that kind of help. When I was about 12 or 13, kind of starting to look at high schools and things like that, my grandma got sick, and the courts ordered the rest of us to go and like move in with my mom, and she was not ready at the time. So she was like, in AA and, these different recovery programs, and like trying to figure it out. I was going to this Jesuit independent middle school at the time, and it took kids from the inner city who were showing promise on test scores and things like that, and then prepared them for New England like day and boarding schools. And like boarding schools out west, right, means something completely different because of the way that they stripped indigenous people of their culture. We've seen a whole bunch of stuff in the news, right? The abuses that have happened, the amount of death and the whole nine. But back east, boarding schools are like Hogwarts, like they are these magical schools for the elites and the ultra wealthy. So I was at a school like that where I was, one of two Black kids in my class, in my graduating class, one of 13 Black kids in the entire school. Um, and I made the decision to like want to go to a boarding school. I didn't know anything about like racism, oppression. I didn't have any of the social justice language, but for me at the time, it was, I need a safe place to be. I need like consistent food on the table. I can't be in a dangerous situation. Like there were so many things that were going on at home that people didn't really know or understand. And it took me a really long time to just get comfortable with sharing that stuff. For a long time, I was living like this like split life where I was, one way at school, and I just didn't let any of my friends or teachers into what my personal life was like at home. And then I'd be home and I'd have to be a whole other way. And I would never talk about kind of being away at a private boarding school and that whole experience. So I was kind of living that split life for a while. And that eventually I think just took its toll. And especially when I was in college, where I was dealing with a lot of those issues with my mom, and I was learning some of the stuff for the first time. I dated this girl in college who was a psychology major. And so in her textbook, she had like a chapter on addiction. And I was like, what's that? Like, let me read some of that stuff. Like those notes sound real familiar. Like they're speaking about my life. um and that's where I started to kind of learn some of the stuff, and I realized how um trauma and its impact on the brain and the body, and how addiction like really works, and how it's a sickness, and how it's really been criminalized, in our government, our society, and the whole nine. So I think kind of learning a lot of those things really put me on this path where I started to look at social issues differently. I started to reflect on my own experience growing up in a low income community, where we saw all of these different things. We just didn't have a vocabulary to talk about what oppression looked like and felt like. Um, so I wanted to go down this path where I wanted to help people, and I wanted to use my gifts and talents to do that. And I ended up leaving college. I didn't graduate or anything like that. Still haven't yet. But it was an opportunity for me to kind of dive right into community work, and being there for young people in a way that other adults were there for me, and help to kind of step in and fill some of those gaps. I wanted to just be a positive contributor and to disrupt that cycle of hopelessness, of addiction, of trauma, and that kind of stuff, and really kind of lean into my strengths there. So yeah, those are, I think, some of the big challenges and obstacles in my life that I've worked to overcome. And it's been 15 years since I taught my first student, and it's been like a really incredible journey since then.
Yeah, I just want to give you a little kudos because like there's so many people that grow up in those types of situations, and so many people like period that grow up in those environments, and a lot of people, and this is like there's no shame in this at all because it's a cycle, right? So the fact that like a lot of people get sucked into that way of doing things, they see this is how my parent copes, so this is how we cope, right? And so the fact that like you as a person had something different, like no, it's more like here in your heart where you kind of like felt that segue, between like like the boarding school being something appealing to you, even though you were, different than a lot of the kids that were there, and putting yourself in that had to be super uncomfortable, like just being in a group of people that's not like you, that probably doesn't relate to anything that you've been through. And like choosing that and continuing to choose that throughout life is just like so special. So special. And then to keep expanding on that and teaching, like kudos, that's amazing.
Thank
um
you.
Definitely a an ode to you and disrupting the pattern, you know what I
yeah,
mean? Like being a force to break the cycle is a beautiful thing.
yeah, and then it ripples, you know, because you're not only are you breaking generational curses really in your own bloodline and for your own siblings even, but then also now that expands outward to every child that you touch, every human being that's touched by your message. So
A pioneer for the other direction.
yeah.
Absolutely. Um,
Mhm.
so that's awesome. What just to piggyback off what she said with the adversity, and the ways that you've grown through that, what are like some specific methods that you've used to heal?
Yeah. Um, Writing is like the biggest thing. Um, I started writing like raps and poems and stuff like that back in middle school. I was 12 when I wrote my first rap. And I started really because my brother was a poet, and he used to write poetry for girls in high school. That was his thing. And then he would sell his poems to his friends so that they can impress the ladies that they were trying to get with. So it was like poetry was my brother's hustle for a little while. And he won like $500 at this poetry contest at the library. And I'm like, oh, like this is serious. But I'm not gonna go down this path of like hustling love poems. I want to write about like real stuff. And some of my favorite like MCs were like Kweli and Common and folks like that. So for me, I was in this space where I knew how powerful kind of sharing your story can be. But when I first started, it was just like I was mimicking a lot of what I was hearing on radio and TV, until I had a mentor and advisor of mine kind of find one of my rap notebooks and was like, is this really you, like the stuff that you're writing, or like, is that what you want people to know you as, or is there more to you than that? And what I found was the more and more I told my story, not just like the celebratory moments and the stuff I wanted to brag on, but the stuff that was painful, the stuff that I was going through at the time, the more it helped people really connect and relate. And I think that was healing because for me, what it showed me was that, I wasn't going through that stuff alone, that there were other people who were dealing with stuff like having a single parent, like having, drug and alcohol addiction as part of their family, right? Dealing with the challenges of being different, of being the only, right? And stuff like that. That was really interesting to kind of watch that grow and evolve over time. And I think that whenever I've dealt with issues overall, that's been the one consistent thing that I've always had to turn to, is just I throw on some music for me, and then I'm gonna write through a lot of stuff and just process that way. When I was younger, it was a lot of basketball, and then through therapy, you learn about like meditation and some breathing techniques and things like that. But for me, I think I'm a thinker, and I need a lot of time to really process stuff. And what I realized was that in the situations I was in, I wasn't always going to be given that time. So kind of learning how to ask for time, to just consider some things, and kind of figuring out where my boundaries were with people before I was saying just like yes to everything. And I wanted to say yes to everything because it like, when you're trying to move away from something that's negative, anything that's in the positive direction, right? Like you want to say yes to, but not everything that's positive is really like meant for you either, right? And that process of discovering your own talents and gifts and like what's really for you, that was a really interesting kind of part of the journey as well. I said yes to a lot, to the point where I was like super stressed out in high school and like really stretched. And even in college, I noticed myself doing that too. I was like taking a full course load, 6 classes, working 3 jobs, volunteering, running an intramural sports program, tutoring, like doing all this stuff. And I'm like, man, I can't say yes to all of these really amazing things that I'm doing. I really need to like focus and do a few things just really well. And it took a long time to really learn those lessons too.
Yeah.
So I think that those are just some of the things. Like, writing has always been there for me. It's always been one of those things where I can process a lot of stuff internally. Getting out there, as a former athlete, I'd like to say, because I used to play basketball like every day for years. And that was just like one of those like ways to get the physical release. Some people like to go on walks or go on a hike in nature, but I'm a city boy. Like the park, and the park even in my background here is like the place where I would go and just get shots up, and that repetition, hearing the ball bounce and that kind of thing was a meditative in a way. So writing, basketball, and then figuring out where my boundaries were all parts of that process.
Got you. A quick follow-up so when you say writing, you mean more of like writing to music, or do you actually have like a journaling practice too, where you might process your feelings, process your emotions, maybe something that's going through? Because I can relate. Like I've written a little bit to music. I'm not an artist per se, but I do like some poetry. I do like writing to some beats. But just recently, in the last couple of years, that I have been writing out journal entries on processing, maybe keep myself accountable on what I'm trying to go after, or even processing some like recent, either some trauma or some emotions, some feelings that I don't know how to communicate to maybe her, or how to maneuver with my family. So I just want to have you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by writing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for me, I've never been in a quiet space. I think like living in a city, living in a full house, right? Like there's never really been quiet. So for me, I think having music on and then just writing whatever comes out. So if it's a rap, then that's cool.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'm like listening to music and then I just start writing poetry. Or sometimes I'm just like, I need to actually just organize my thoughts. And I might start with like a to-do list of all of these things that have been on my mind that have been stressing me out or been really concerning, and let me start with this to-do list and let me figure out how I break stuff down to then get to this place where I feel good about just taking the next step instead of being stuck. So I think it would just depend, and it wasn't an everyday practice. I think I had some teachers who tried to do that like in middle school and in high school, like have us write in a journal every day, and it was never great when it's forced, but
Right.
I think recognizing that it was a tool that I could use when I needed it was important. So it wasn't like every day, but probably maybe 2 to 3 times or 3 to 4 times a week, I think was what it was. And it was different every time, but it wasn't silent in the practice. It was always like, I'm going to throw some music on. Maybe it's beats, or maybe it's some like Nas Illmatic or some Black Star, right? Like just something just to have that background noise. And then I'm going to start to write, and whatever comes out is whatever comes out. Those moments where I felt really creative, there were some beautiful things that came out of that. But there were a whole bunch of times where it was like, I'm just like, I'm stuck and I'm frustrated and I can't figure out what it is that is like keeping me from moving to the next step. So I would just write down like this particular issue, or maybe it was somebody's name that was stressing me out, and I was trying to figure out like why that was the case and how I got to that point and what I could do about it that'd be different so I can get a different outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing. No matter what the process is for getting a brain dump exercise out. Like for you, it works with music. Other people, it works in silence. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I just to like expand a little bit on that, I have a journaling practice that I've just found a lot of like safe space in journaling as kind of a more progressed adult now. Just kind of what you were saying, like having no expectations on it, but even if it's just like, waking up in the morning and writing down 5 things I'm grateful for, or you know, anything like that, or like you were saying, just like organizing your thoughts, or maybe you just like have something that's really bothering you and you just want to get it out of your head and onto paper. I feel like it's really important to have to figure out, and whether that's journaling or something else, but just as a conscious human to figure out how to hold a safe space for yourself in whatever way that looks like to you. So even basketball, like you were saying, like meditative experience, like ways to move energy through, you know? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I love that. I love that that's something that you've kind of leaned into. So Kendall MIT has been playing in my head. Kendall MIT. So I would love, I did a quick little Google search on it, and I discovered it's a transit station. So I'd love to learn more about what does Kendall MIT mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a couple of things. One, it was one of the neighborhoods where my mom lived. You know, when the courts kind of ordered that we move over to where my mom lived. I grew up in Jamaica Plain, predominantly like Latino neighborhood. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, been there for generations. It wasn't always a Latino neighborhood, you know, it grew and evolved over time. But, you know, we had people who like own their own businesses. We had an international supermarket, you know what I mean, in the neighborhood, and banks and schools and the whole nine, right? So you had this community that had been there for a really long time. My mom lived in Cambridge, so it was across the Charles River, and she was living in Kendall Square. And, you know, a lot of people, when they think about Cambridge, Massachusetts, they think about these two places. They think about Harvard, right? Harvard University. It's like, you know, obviously everyone knows Harvard. Then they think about MIT. But they don't think about anybody else that lives there. And neither do those universities, right? So like you literally, they're maybe 2 train stops away from each other. But in Kendall Square, there's the campus of MIT, and then literally across the street, there's like the projects and low income communities, right? And that's like where my mom was. And you know, growing up, that kind of, again, that dichotomy of like you have access to like the wealthiest, the craziest, like educational institution, opportunity, all that stuff, you know, on one side, and then on the other side you have folks who are like trying to figure out where their next meal coming from. They live on food stamps, you know what I mean? They're taking bus and train everywhere, or we walked all over Cambridge, you know, and that was regular, but for some people they couldn't imagine what that kind of life was like. So that entire song, you know, and my brothers can really validate everything I said in that song. But it's kind of, I wanted to document what that experience was like, you know, the corner of Windsor and Market Street where you know, where my mom lived, and how you know, my little sister was bullied over there, how we got into fights and that kind of stuff, how my older brother tried to talk to this girl Yachty who lived right across the street. And just that whole experience of like what it was like, the good parts and the bad parts, you know, being profiled, being arrested, getting to this huge fight with my little brother's dad, you know, and like he came at me with a hammer over, you know, this wild stuff, right? And I was like really ready to just go like toe to toe with this grown man as a teenager over, you know, my little brother, and that kind of thing. And there were all of those different experiences, and there are people who just will never know or understand what that kind of stuff, what that life is like. So I wanted to create this song to show people that this is what my adolescence was that it was living on both sides of that split, like having to be home, you know, become the man of the house at 14, 15 years old, having my mom resent me for some of that stuff that, you know, were choices I was making then that I thought were the responsible adult type choices we should be making, but my mom being an actual adult who felt like I shouldn't be taking on that stuff or telling her what to do. And all this kind of stuff, right? So there's that side of it, and then there's the other side of it of, where I'm trying to be competitive with the top minds in the country, at the high school level, but then, even when I went on to college, it was the same sort of thing. And these kids are some of the most elite minds. They come from these, wealthy families. They've had everything kind of handed to them. So then it's really easy to be successful when you have all of those layers of privilege kind of built on. So then, for me, trying to figure out how do I compete or how do I survive and really make it happen, despite all the challenges and adversity, was something that I struggled with for, I mean, easily over a decade of my life, and not a lot of people get a chance to experience a day of that. So I
Yeah,
wanted to capture that in the music, and that's one of those songs.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, like you said, there's a lot of people that have never experienced things like that or wouldn't know what that's like. I'm one of those people. I mean, I grew up in a rural, not super wealthy neighborhood, but like I definitely had everything I needed provided for me. And didn't ever have to like be concerned about my safety. And I'm a very empathetic person. Also, I grew up in like a mono culture, right? Like mainly white people. There might have been like two Black people in our school, maybe like one Asian person. That was it. And everyone was posing as straight, posing as Christian, like just trying to be this like in this box. So for me, and that's part of the reason I'm from Michigan and I moved out to California. That was a huge reason that I moved out to California, was because I wanted to learn more about how other people everywhere exist. I wanted exposure to adversity from other people. I'd gone through my own adversity as well, but totally different, but also very similar in different ways, in terms of the way that it traumatized me. So when I hear, this is something that I find really attractive in artists. So I love, your energy, your music, everything. Like, even if you weren't listening to the words that you're saying, like the energy that you bring, especially in a live setting, is something that it's rare. It just feels like home. And then when you do like tap in and listen to what you're saying, I can feel that, like I can feel the energy of your experiences. So the way that you kind of articulate yourself, the way that you like paint a picture for people, allows empathetic humans to kind of get a glimpse of what you're talking about. So that's super special. And yeah, I just wanted to
Thank you.
share that with you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's my biggest goal with the writing, is I really want people to connect and to feel it differently.
Yeah.
And that's what's been amazing about even just performing with the band over the past couple of years. Has really been, when people get to hear the music live, it sets a different emotional tone
Most definitely.
in the physical space. And I think a lot of the stuff that I produced earlier in my career, while it was dope kind of lyrically, and I was still growing as an artist and that kind of stuff, I think being locked in to a specific beat or tempo and just that loop was one of those things where it's like people are like, okay, this is cool, but like the emotional resonance, it doesn't always hit. And when you have a song that kind of builds and changes throughout, the experience with live musicians, and everything's not perfect, it's not super lock in step, with a particular type of tempo, it just changes the feel. And it's been dope to kind of even like learn that part of the craft as an MC, by like what it's been like to perform live with just beats, and how to move a crowd and rock a show, but then having that show really evolve and change by working with a live band that really knows your music. It's been an amazing lesson as well.
The band, we recognize them from some of them from the Philharmonic shows, and very similar energy. We love him too for a lot of this similar painting of pictures. So they like it really brings this experience together. It's like all the senses are kind of being engaged.
Yeah, and the Philharmonic is a really good friend of mine. He's like a real brother to me. We were literally just texting yesterday. He produced the last album that I released called Promise, and he's introduced me to a bunch of local musicians. I've met a bunch of folks through him, and Alicia with the band Hayez, and Basi Vibe. He used to do this event called the Vibe with Sessions.
Yeah, we were always there.
He still does it, right?
Yeah, out there in Ali Stephen Square.
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, that's where I really got to meet a lot of folks, and where they got to hear me, you know, rap over the band in an improvisational setting. And we're like, okay, we got to work together. We got to figure this out. And we eventually did.
Philharmonic was our first like conscious Sac artist that kind of got us hooked into that community.
Yeah.
Him particularly, he kind of introduced me.
Yeah, I can't even remember what the first song was, but I just remember hearing his voice and seeing him play and being like, this guy is amazing.
Yeah.
And then we were able to check him out at like a coffee spot, and then like a local venue like Ace of Spades, and then we saw him go on tour with Howard Johnson and the Lovemakers and Nate Curry, and we're like, yeah, Sac on the map, let's go. And then,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Actually, I had a because I feel like he's seen me so many times. Like I've seen him at Art and Mall, I've seen him at a coffee shop, we've been to his shows. He opened up his spot to me, where I went over, picked up tickets, and we got to chop it up a little bit about just like our backgrounds and stuff. So that it's been really cool to watch that relationship evolve. You know, I don't like before then I wasn't really doing music, and now I'm like making beats. So it'd be cool for that to come into play maybe eventually.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to talk about the music aspect, since you've already talked about a couple things with that. You said that you started when you were 12 years old, basically writing poetry. And then you said you've been in Sac for about the last decade, last 10 years. So is that like 2012?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, December 1st, 2011. That's my caliversary.
Okay. So looking at your earliest project that I found on Apple Music, it was Coast to Coast, which was in 2014. So from the time that you came into California to the time that you released that project, also if there's any unknown projects that aren't on Apple Music that you made in between there, I would love to hear whatever you got to say.
Yeah. There were 2 mixtapes that came out that I can't actually throw up on streaming because they're other people's beats.
Yeah.
But I was trying to figure it out. So it's funny because right now I'm like sitting in my apartment. I've been here for like just as long, and my first 2 mixtapes, they were called one was Marked at Birth. It was a spoken word tape. And the second one was called As They Reminisce Over Hip Hop. And then it was like a tribute tape to my favorite artists, and I just like rapped over the beats of my favorite artists. So like Nas and Common and DJ Premier and like Tupac and Big and like a whole bunch of stuff. And it was recorded literally right here in my living room. And my homie Natho came out. Now Natho is huge. He like does videos for like Instagram models and like big artists and all this stuff. Like he's a big time kind of videographer. But I met Natho when he was rapping, and he was working on his first kind of project to kind of put it out there in the world. And he was producing beats, and he was engineering and doing all this stuff. And I was like, hey man, like I've never been to a studio. Like I've only ever recorded like at my friend's place back home in Boston. I want to show people that I'm serious and I'm willing to put some money up. You know, I've been sitting on a couple of projects. Would you be down to record me? And he's like, yeah, man, I'll bring my mobile, you know, setup to you, and we'll get those done. And so we recorded those. And if you go back and listen to some of those on my Bandcamp, you're like, what is this? But it was cool because I think a lot of concepts were there. It was just like where I was at kind of mentally at that time. But you could tell I was just starting to figure it out, figuring out how to rap in the pocket, you know, what it's like to kind of rap over different types of beats, figuring out what my voice was going to sound like, what's my particular sound, and that kind of stuff. And I knew I wanted to do this blend of like hip hop and spoken word. I just didn't know how it fit together, right? I had heard some of my favorite artists do some really interesting things, but I wasn't sure how that stuff got put together. And it's like, there's a really funny story even about that. Um, one of the artists I looked up to growing up back home, his name is Mr. Liff, like real famous, like well-known, like underground artist from Boston, but he like took some time and like toured the country and is like doing some really dope stuff. He put out this record, and I want to say it was called I Phantom, or and in it there was this skit at the end of the record of like some like bus crash, and it sounded like a news reporter, reported on a story where he might have passed away or something crazy. And I'm thinking in my like 14-year-old brain, oh my gosh, this artist actually passed away. We may not ever hear from him again. To like meeting him and opening up for him in Sacramento, like back in like 2016, maybe. Yeah, and it blew my mind because I was like, wait a minute, like I literally thought you were dead. But like after I had like taken some time to, go through the recording process, I went back and listened to some of that stuff. I'm like, oh, that's how that was made. You know what I mean? Like there's certain filters you can add on somebody's voice to make it sound slightly distorted. There's certain things that sound effects and things that you can add and do. You can add sirens in the background and crowd noise and all this crazy stuff. And for me, I was so new to it. I just didn't have that understanding. But it's been really cool, I think, to go back and listen to that stuff and then to watch my projects kind of grow and evolve. But I want to say it's been 10 that people have heard out, like 10 albums that are out right now that people have heard. I've recorded an 11th one, and that was supposed to come out actually before Wonderland. But my producer, Lewis Morris, who's somebody who I collaborate with frequently, we've probably only met maybe 3 times in person in like real life, but we have maybe 35 to 40 songs like together in the catalog. But we were working on an album called Coast to Coast 2. And it was an opportunity to kind of revisit the older album. But Lewis wasn't really rapping on that first version. He made all the beats on Coast to Coast, but nobody got a chance to hear him rap or do his thing. So in Coast to Coast 2 was going to be that. It was going to be like me and him rapping together over beats that he produced. And it's like 16 tracks long. It just hasn't dropped. So yeah, so you look at the entire process, 11 albums later, probably like 50 unreleased songs that are just in the vault and like either waiting to be finished or waiting to be mastered and that kind of thing. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that I've been able to do that's really helped me grow.
Amazing. So these 2 mixtapes that you had mentioned, they're on Bandcamp. Can't you put mixtapes and stuff like that on SoundCloud too?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think my account on SoundCloud is a paid account, so I have a limit for how much stuff I can actually put up.
Okay.
But yeah, no, but what I did put up on my SoundCloud are a couple different playlists. One's like a sampler of stuff kind of throughout the years that gives people a good idea of the kind of stuff that I've made in the past and the kind of stuff I'm working on now. So that's a really cool place to get a quick introduction. There's also like some other artists who I like really look up to and respect that are there. There's I did a top 5 list of like conscious artists that you should know about from Sacramento who are conscious and not corny. You know what I mean? And I put that list on up on SoundCloud with a couple of tracks from them. Rudy Calma is another Sacramento-based artist who's super dope. Filipino MC, and he just kills it. Obasi Shah, who was a Harvard student, who's like his like master's thesis or whatever it was, like final thing, was a hip hop album.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's just like really kind of surprising to hear that kind of stuff, but it's dope. And so like I like repost that kind of stuff, artists who I'm really impressed by on my SoundCloud. So it's a good place to kind of find some new people.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for putting this on, because yeah, we're definitely gonna check it out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm gonna kind of switch gears a little bit here. So this is kind of back into what you were kind of touching on in the documentary, kind of talking about gentrification and just social justice in general. In our current landscape, like the world has obviously shifted a lot in the last year and a half and some change. What in this current cultural context does revolution mean to you?
Mm.
Yes.
That's a great question.
Thank
Um, I've always believed that you can't change the outer world, all of these external things, until you change the inner world.
you.
You know, so I think that revolution really starts within.
Mhm.
And when you can do things like discipline your mind, um, and begin to make kind of choices and decisions about the way that you choose to show up in the world, the way that you want to live your life, and that really affects everything from like your purchasing decisions to where you decide to work or what you decide to work on, right? That kind of stuff I think is really important, because I think that there are a lot of folks who have made decisions without that level of intentionality, without thinking about the collective first. And it's a very kind of Western philosophical, mindset. But I think that's also been one of the reasons that we've seen so much inequity, that we see so much kind of injustice and oppression in the world, is when people think that that their experience, their human experience, is not tied to the experiences of others.
Yeah.
So I think that revolution starts within. And when you realize how connected you are to every other kind of living being on the planet, then everything else that you do for the outside world will shift and change as well.
I love that. And I think just to expand on that, because everything that you said, I'm in full agreement on. And I feel like something that I've noticed that that gets to shift in this more modern context is the fact that this like the dichotomy that you were speaking about, but just this, like we have this side and that side. So there's always this like winner and loser mentality. So it's like if I win, someone has to lose. So it breeds this self-centered mentality that, and capitalism only feeds into that, where we're all just like here for ourselves. So from my perspective, and it's super in alignment with yours, is that in 2020 on, it's more about this like collective, like how can I serve first? And like you said, it starts within and just having that self-awareness. And then how can I use that overflow to just like pour into others? And then knowing that in doing that and aligning my life with the highest good of all, abundance is going to find me in so many unexpected ways. So I love that. Yeah.
It's interesting. And when I was looking for my community, and I stumbled across this open mic that was happening at Soul Collective back in 2013. I looked into the organization. I was hearing about it from some of the artists who were there, and they're a nonprofit community center that focuses on art, culture, and activism. And they move with that collective mindset and approach. And to me, that was revolutionary. A lot of the stuff that they are working on, they provide, if programming isn't free, then it's very low cost for a whole bunch of different communities. But they do everything from like yoga and meditation to indigenous music jam sessions to danza azteca, like practice and rehearse in that space. They provide music and concert space, workshops. The Sacramento Activist School will meet there, and there's so many other things that happen in that space that's like community led and driven. And while, you know, the nonprofit organization part of it provides a little bit of that structure, when you look at kind of the methodology and approach, you know, I think that they're one of the leaders in Sacramento around collective organizing and action and what that can look like and how transformative it can be. And that's just been an amazing community to be a part of. You know, I started again, like just as an artist at one of the open mics to then volunteering for a few years. I joined the advisory board for a couple of years and I sit on the executive board there. But it was an amazing opportunity to kind of watch this organization grow and change with the community and, you know, at the priority, at the center of the decision making. Yeah, and now we're having these conversations because we just bought the building, and like really excited about that and getting ready to kind of build 6 stories up to provide more opportunities for people to engage in the kind of work that we've been talking about. But it's a really kind of special place, and you know, we're now talking about like legacy and how do you pass down, you know, this kind of culture. It's not really written, it's more of a feel, you know, it's how you experience people and how you have these conversations. So we're like, you know, at a really crucial point right now, but it's been exciting to kind of see that and to be a part of that collective action.
I love that. I'm definitely gonna have to learn more about Soul Collective. That's something
Mhm.
I have been personally craving is more service. My work is service based, but you know, more on like a volunteer, like getting into organizations like that. So thank you for bringing that to light.
Yeah. I remember hearing about Soul Collective when we first moved to Midtown. We were off T Street, and I think that was when I had first heard of the Philharmonic, and he was doing events on Sundays, I think, out there. But at the time, my job, it didn't allow me to get out there around that time. But
Same.
that was right around the time where I was getting into beats, and it would have been cool to like get around some people who could show me a little bit more about music production. I found my way, but I do have kind of a grasp on an outsider looking in that they're definitely people first. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, my next question is going to be another gentrification type of focus. So you already talked about it. You obviously talked about it in the documentary with CV Street, CV Circle.
Mhm.
And we know hits home for you in the album with Heat Street. I'm guessing that was in Jamaica Plain, right?
Yeah.
And so with that, like give you some context with me, I grew up in North Highlands from like first to sixth grade, and it was kind of a rougher area, but my mom had taken us to Folsom to get us out of like the dangerous aspect of that area. And we were in Folsom, and it's kind of like safe type of thing. But kind of related to your boarding school in experience with like very few colored people around. But anyways, I don't really have a grasp on growing up in a community and then coming back years later and seeing that it looks nothing the same. They're raising rent prices and pushing people out. I hear about stories about it. I hear about it in Oakland. I've heard about it from your experience. Can you talk more about your personal experience in living and then going and seeing that it's different completely?
Yeah. It's wild because my grandmother's house is now an Airbnb.
Oh,
Wow.
You know what I mean? So like it's hard. Like a lot of people can go home, you know what I mean, to go see their grandma or grandpa, whoever.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I can't, you know what I mean? So it's just like a really interesting kind of personal connection. But when I see really what's happened here in Sacramento, and you see how folks who are getting priced out of the Bay Area are moving, you know, to find places where they can live, work, and commute in. You look at the rising rents in Midtown and downtown Sacramento. You look at you know, this community that's really been redlined and separated out of, you know, the rest of Sacramento. And CV Circle has been a forgotten community in many ways, right? The community used to be like public housing back in like the 40s and was predominantly like a Jewish community, and there was like economic mobility, and people weren't, you know, decade after decade, generation after generation, weren't stuck in the projects, right? But after a certain point, you look at the 50s and the 60s, and then how the FHA wasn't providing loans to Black families, how soldiers were coming home from the war, but being told that they couldn't live in certain areas of the city. You literally, if you take Fifth Street all the way down to Vallejo Way, and you see that there's literally this maybe 8 to 10 foot fence that separates the projects right here in Sacramento from single family homes with backyards that are probably worth 400,000 to $500,000. You have people who live literally right across on the other side of the fence, who make less than maybe $10,000 a year. You know what I mean? Like it's this wild thing. And there used to be a lot of like industrial factory buildings kind of over there too, from Broadway till about from Broadway to about McClatchy Way. You know, if you're going down Fifth Street, maybe, I don't know, not more than a mile stretch of road. But now all those factories have been shut down and closed up. And what's replaced all that stuff are these like high-end condos, luxury homes that start at $300,000 and then go up from there.
300,000. It's like, yeah. Don't mean to interrupt you, but
no, yeah, I mean, but it's a real thing. So it's wild because, I used to take the 51, the bus from Oak Park, up to, about the fire station, and I would walk to the elementary school that's back there. And it maybe 15 to 20-minute walk, not super long. But as I'm walking every day for like 5 years, what I see is this go from like nothing, you know what I mean? This like, industrial land that nobody was using. And then I watch these condos being built over time. And then I'm hearing the conversation in the community. I'm seeing our kids who are, going to the school, hop on their bikes and want to roll through, and their initial, interactions with the neighbors not being so friendly. You see the Nextdoor app. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but it's an opportunity where neighbors can connect with other neighbors. But there are people in Land Park who are like really racist and have said the wildest things about young people who live literally just like a block or two away from where they stay. So you see these things, you hear these things, you hear about how, even at McClatchy High School, which is like the high school in Land Park, right? It's right there on Freeport Boulevard. The kids from my community have to walk about 2 miles to kind of get to McClatchy High School. But even when they get there, right, there's not a ton of other kids who like have shared their experience. Like all of our, like we had at the elementary school, again, like this school services all of these families, about 1,500 families or so, but not everybody has kids at the same time. So it's a smaller school. It's probably like 300, maybe 50 students, at the elementary school. And so when we graduate, anywhere between 30 to 45 kids every year, they're in the same like middle school cohort as well, right? So they don't get blended in with all of the other like Land Park kids and the whole nine. So then by the time they get to high school, right, it's almost like they're their own separate population, and then the access and resources just aren't the same. And while at the middle school level, right, on paper it like looks like it's a really good school, and at the high school level it's the same thing. Like they have this HISP program and all this stuff, but when you really dive into the numbers and you start to track our kids from the elementary to the middle school to the high school level, you recognize that the impact of housing segregation, racism, gentrification is also impacting educational outcomes, which then also tracks to like, whether or not kids can find well-paying jobs, in the community, right? It's harder to do that when all you have is a high school degree and, you don't have access or opportunity to pay for college or even go because you're missing so much along the way, right? So, you look at how all of those issues and things are connected and you start to really understand and see the system for what it is. And what's been amazing has been seeing how there are some folks in the community that really work to kind of galvanize around, this group of kids and their families and supporting CV Circle. I'm one of those folks, but you look at folks from Bayside, Midtown, which is a church community. Look at another church community called Trinity that provides donations for food and clothes for families and students in need. But they do everything from like summer programs, running after schools to, providing all types of supports, throughout the year. The schools really become a community hub. So it's with that lens that I share those stories, right? And it's the reason why I wanted to focus on that community in particular was because people don't get to hear from the folks who live there, who work there, who understand those issues from that perspective. So I wanted to spotlight those people in the film and not speak for them, but to allow them to speak for themselves. And you hear what they have to say. And not everybody agrees on everything. That's not what, you know what I mean? I think folks also think that those communities should speak with one voice, but it's more nuanced than that, right? Absolutely. And you really have to pay attention to, what is it that folks are asking for? What are they not asking for? Because it's the people who are most proximate to the issues who really understand what the solutions to those issues need to be. That was something I learned from Brian Stevenson, who's like civil rights attorney, Just Mercy, like that guy. I had a chance to see him speak, and when he delivered that message, that's something that's also really stuck with me too.
Yeah, it's like not taking those communities and seeing them as like a monolith, but then kind of opening up the conversation that's being had within that community, within the various groups of people within that community, who have various perspectives, various ideas of what proper solutions could be, rather than, standing back outside of the community and being like, oh, poor these people, let's just like throw money at the problem or whatever, but not actually hear from the people that are being affected and that know what's best for the community. I think that's amazing. And I think also just noticing that like all of the things that you said that are being offered to that community are amazing. That's just like really a testament to Sacramento as a community. And there's likely a lot of communities around the country who don't have that kind of support. Like even with the support, it's still so much adversity for these kids to go through, from, maybe getting themselves ready for school and then walking 2 miles to get to school. Like I don't think people that grew up with the resources that maybe I had or even more can really grasp or like think about how much stress that puts on a child. But then like if you add on top of that, even having no help, no resources, it's no wonder why, a lot of communities that are kind of that fall through the cracks need assistance, and not just like a handout, but recognizing the difference between someone who's making $10,000 a year versus someone who's making $500,000 a year or more. Like the fact that someone could have enough wealth to own a home that costs $300,000 to $500,000, like you can imagine all of the opportunity that comes with that. And then in stark comparison to people who are like, dealing with making 10 grand a year or less, and then like all of the problems that come from that, and all the things that you can't afford to take care of for yourself. So
and it's wild. There was actually something that we cut from the film, and maybe I should do like a whole director's cut and like put it back in. But we went to go do some filming over. I want to say it was like the Christmas holiday break, and we pull up to the neighborhood. There's not like a lot of like anybody outside, and I'm like, oh, this is strange and interesting and like really different. But I'm going to meet somebody and I'm going to interview them. He's an AAU coach, so we're going to one of the basketball courts. And then there's like a shooting that happens like while we're there. Like I'm literally like about to get my cameraman out the car and like we're about to set up in the whole nine. And then there's the shooting that happens. We hear pop, 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 pop. And then we start to see people running. And I'm just like, yo, get back in the car, keep all your equipment there, like stay low, the whole nine. And like he wasn't super phased by it because he was a military guy and he was just like, okay, like I kind of know the drill. Um, but then after kind of cars clear out, people clear out the whole nine, there are a couple of neighbors who like ducked down and we could see them kind of in between the cars. And I'm like, yo, man, like everybody good? Like you okay? Like you cool? They're like, yeah, this is now starting to become normal. We just had like another shooting like this literally like 3 days ago, which would have put it like Christmas Eve. You know what I mean? Like, so there are some people where like those types of conditions have become normalized and there wasn't a police response. There wasn't like a whole bunch of like activation or anything like that. It was just like, oh, well, this is going to happen. So people just keep their kids inside and like hope for the best. And I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like no kid should have to worry about that kind of stuff when they're like at home for their holiday break. Like that's not, you know, the life that we want for our young people. We want them to feel safe and like they have access and opportunity in their neighborhood. And again, like those buildings have been there since the 30s and 40s. So the city and other developers are looking to tear those buildings down to then create like mixed income housing. And it's not that that's a bad thing, right? Mixed income housing has you know, shown and really proved that some really great results in other communities. But when you look at who the specific families and individuals are, you have to ask the question, who's being moved out? Where are they being moved out to? They obviously can't live in Sacramento. So then everything in their support system that's been here is not going to be destroyed, right? And like, and then what are people going to lean on? Not to move all the way out to like Vegas or some other places to find somewhere that's like decent housing and affordable for them. And that's been, I think, my biggest like struggle is that if you're going to, you know, renovate these buildings and create something new, don't forget about the people who exist there. Like I want them to be part of the plan and the intentionality behind anything that's new that's going to be there. So if you create the space for them, create space for other people too, sure. But like at the core of this project should be we're creating space for the people who already live here and we're not going to lose track of them. We're going to make sure that they get what they need. But yeah, just the city doesn't do a good job of stuff like that. And that's the biggest issue I think I have with gentrification as a whole is that it's not that it doesn't have some positive things that come along with it. Increased safety, maybe better business opportunities, maybe better attention or that kind of thing. Maybe you can get rid of some of the negative branding or stereotypes of old neighborhoods. And I get that, you know, but when you completely replace all of the people, and a lot of the people in, you know, there are just like working class people and they're trying to make it and they're trying to find a way. And they want, you know, the same for their kids. Then you realize that you probably are doing more harm than good by moving forward with those plans without including the people as part of it.
Yeah, and I think when you say like increased safety and increased opportunity, you have to also like follow that up with for whom, because like you said, if you know, okay, maybe like we characterize this neighborhood as safer now, but why? Is it because now we have like people that didn't grow up in those situations and maybe that's not normal to them, so maybe gun violence isn't as present in those communities? Cool, I'm glad that they're safe, but now you have, like you said, all these families displaced, who now have less of a community around them, like you said. So I just kind of want to paint this picture for anyone that might be watching or listening to this that grew up like me, who is, you know, a compassionate person, and hasn't had these experiences of like normalized gun violence and things like that, just to really like take a second to paint the picture in your head of like how that must feel and what that experience has to be like growing up as a child, and how normalized stress and anxiety and fear probably have to be. And then on top of that, like what that does to the body, to your mindset, to everything that you exist within, and then how you continue to manifest that reality for yourself throughout life. So I think like if we're talking about like caring for these communities and not simply just like neglecting them, pushing them away, like out of sight, out of mind, we also have to remember that, where it's like, is there something restorative that we're investing in these communities so that children, some kind of therapy later on in life, or even like as they grow up? Because if you're walking to school 2 miles a day and gun violence is normal, like I think like how could I even imagine and like fathom like how stressful that is every day, or like if I would even go.
Yeah, no, those are all important things to think about and to consider. Absolutely. And it's part of the reason why I believe that schools should be community hubs,
Yeah.
those resources, right? So if that's the one place where that you can be safe, where you can get meals and the whole nine, then I believe that it should also be the place where you access mental health resources, where there's a school nurse on every campus, where if you need referrals or other kind of social services, that you have access to those things through the school site. And I also encourage people to look at Sacramento schools and what schools are really well resourced and which ones aren't, because that's also tied to redlining and gentrification and the property values and incomes of families and what the value of the home is in particular neighborhoods. And that's not something that like an individual can control, right? But it's something that collectively we have to think about as an entire city, and figure out a way to restructure those funding formulas for schools. And even without kind of the local control, accountability funding, and that kind of stuff in place, which is a way to get federal dollars to school districts, and then allowing school districts and principals to then decide really where that funding goes.
Mhm.
Oftentimes that funding still isn't enough for
Mhm.
communities that are really in need. They really, those school communities really need a lot more. And that's where I think private businesses, corporations, and just individuals who are willing to give of their time and energy to figure out what's happening at school sites and how they can help, that part really goes a long way.
Yeah, and I think one last little thing on this that I've noticed since I've lived in Sacramento specifically, is like holding those who are receiving that funding accountable to where the funding is actually going, making sure that that's like responsibly allocated, and that, like we said earlier, they are leaning on community members to see what that community specifically needs. One last point to that is like, in that the high school environment you're talking about, where it's like the land park students, and then we have the CV circle community, where is the funding going for that school? I don't know if this is a question that you can actually answer, or this could just also be just a question to ponder, but like, knowing that predominantly white, wealthier land park students probably have more money, coming in from their families, and then therefore resources. So is the money from that school actually going into helping, like, to kind of bridging the gap a little bit, or do you know if it's more like
Yeah, it's really interesting, because if you try to get all the schools to talk to each other, they don't. They don't. So the tracking doesn't happen in terms of like understanding what a specific student's needs are, right, at the elementary level. And then by the time they get to high school, right, the things that worked for them and their family early on, there's a gap. It's all kind of, it's like you're starting over every time you go to a new school, and it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing though that it gets really interesting is that, those schools at the middle school level and at the high school level, they are well funded. They have sports programs and they have advanced, kind of gate programs for the gifted and talented and that kind of stuff. But when you look at the outcomes, right, you look at the data and you say, well, how many Black and brown kids exist in those spaces, right? You look at the HISP program, for instance, right, and that was recently in the news. But there were maybe one or two Black kids, and I might be overselling that, right? Because it's, and you have to ask the question about why. Like, why is that? It's not that Black kids are incapable of learning or achieving at high rates, but you have to look at what are the supports that are in place, for them, or the lack of support that's there, for folks to be successful, understanding that if you come from CV Circle in particular, there's a whole other series of challenges. And here's the thing, is that that's just one high school, right? You look at Luther Burbank and South Sac, right? They have a language program for Spanish speaking students, but when you look at the demographics, right? Spanish speaking students, Hmong speaking students, and then English speaking students are roughly about 30% across the board. But there's no Hmong language program at the I think at the middle school level or the high school level. I can't remember, but there's a gap there. And then I know for Spanish for sure, there's not a Spanish language bridge. There's no middle school in South Sacramento with a dual immersion Spanish language program. And you think about that, and it's how did these things happen? Yeah. How does a school with thousands of students have one school nurse when the ratio across the district is 1 to every 750 students, right? So how does a school with 2,000 to 3,000 kids in it only have a single school nurse? It's that kind of stuff. We have to think about these issues systemically, and we have to get really specific about kind of the data, the numbers, the funding, and the whole nine, and the places where the school district falls short or federal dollars fall short. The community then has to step in and meet the rest of the need. But you can't ask a low income community to meet those types of needs for schools, because it's a lot, harder to do that. The money, the equity piece, right, that has to come from somewhere else. And we have to value that as an entire city to make that a reality.
Especially when the gap is so wide, there's plenty of people at a high income bracket that could definitely improve that problem astoundingly, if we really thought as a community versus me, right. My car, my new home, my pool, etc.
Right.
You got another one?
I mean,
I've got one more.
Yeah, let her rattle that off, and then I'll just be asking a what's next type of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So last question for me is, I heard you mention in the film the Black Artists Fund. Was that who, funded the film itself? And I would love to just know more about what that is exactly.
Yeah. And they recently just changed their name to the Black Artist Foundry. So if folks are looking for them, that's what happened. They just went through a rebrand. But I applied actually for their so I'll backtrack. I applied for their first round of funding, and I actually earned $1,000 award, and that went to really help me finish the music, the album stuff. And I applied for the second round of funding because what I wanted to do was I wanted people to hear what the music sounded like live. But my proposal was for I think initially $4,000, because I'd had to pay the entire band to learn all the music. We were paying dancers, we were paying the video guy, the sound engineer, the whole nine. And I got rejected. And it was fine. It's cool, because what was different about them versus any other grant that I've ever applied to was when I asked for feedback as to why I got rejected, we actually were able to have a real deal conversation. And that was incredible. I think that more kind of grantors for artists should definitely look to do that. And part of the conversation, I kind of explained to them like, hey, this is what I'm looking to do and what I'm trying to accomplish. And, you know, it'd be great even if you can help me, like, just point me in the right direction. And what they did was they knew about a different funding mechanism and opportunity. So they connected me with that. And I was able to get, you know, $10,000 from council member Steve Hanson's office to be able to get that work done. And there wasn't like a ton of changes or anything like that. It didn't really disrupt like the mission or the vision. I think a couple of things that were highlighted differently because of that connection were one, we were, you know, we had to do everything within Steve Hanson's district. So like, check, you know what I mean? Like we were able to figure all of that out. That was easy. But then the other part was, you know, just helping people understand how a lot of these social issues that we talked about were also connected or exacerbated by COVID and by a pandemic, right? So we were able to kind of tie those things in pretty seamlessly because it didn't shift the like mission and the vision for what we were trying to do. We were actually able to do more, you know, so we were able to, I was able to pay everybody for all the interviews. So everybody who you saw got paid. And then even the people who you didn't see, like still got paid. So there were like parents and students who were able to get money. You know, when I first got to $10,000, we set aside $1,000 for Ms. T's Urban Dance Academy. And for students who wanted to take lessons, it's about a $25 for the month, for a month of lessons. So we, you know, provided $1,000 to Miss T to just say, hey, if there are families who are struggling right now, who have been consistent but can't afford to, you know, do this during the pandemic, you know, we got some money for y'all to be able to do that. And all we ask in return is you say a few words for the documentary. That'd be cool. And yeah, so we were able to work that out. And Miss T came through. And it's wild because we had a whole conversation for an hour before the film, before like we even started recording her part. So there's so much of that gold that's still out there. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to kind of put some of that material out.
What was her name?
Tamara Sandifer is her whole name.
Yeah, she has a really great energy about her.
Yeah, she stuck out a lot in the documentary for sure.
Yeah, everybody in the community knows her as Miss T, and she's amazing. But that's really how the whole project got paid for. Was Black Artist Fund, was where I initially applied to. And even though I got rejected, just the relationship and their willingness to support an artist like me with the mission that you know, I have, and then connected me to a different funding source that like didn't want to change the overall vision for what I had going on, was dope. So that's really how the project came to be. There were, I want to say maybe 25 or 26 people who were involved in like the filming and the process of putting everything together. So it wasn't just like a one-person show.
Yeah.
I wasn't holding the camera and the microphone and the, you know, like great things don't happen without a village. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Props to the transparency of, you know, I feel like that's a huge point to like focus on, is that even though you got denied, you had that relationship and they were open to why you got denied. I feel like I really resonate with what you're saying about that, and how that should definitely be like a more normalized standard with what am I saying?
With grantors. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And anybody who's giving out money in the city for any reason, I think when folks are interested in applying, they should at least get a response back, like whether or not they, you know, got it or not. And they should get a response that's a personalized, like, hey, here's what we liked, and then here's what was, you know, challenging maybe about your particular proposal, or maybe it was just like, hey, like we wanted projects that fit along these lines, right? And it just, that feedback is so helpful for people, because, you know, otherwise we're just like left wondering.
Yeah.
Totally.
Gives you the opportunity to go back to the drawing board, which is great.
I just wanted to say, when I was in high school, I really wanted to go to the University of Notre Dame. That was like life goals. And the high school I went to, you know, wasn't a great, didn't really set me up to go to a school of that caliber. But I really tried. And when I got denied, they sent me a personalized denial letter, and I framed that at my grad party. So I was just so proud. I was like, look at what Notre Dame has to say about me, like the positives, the things that I can improve on. But rather than like not hearing back and then getting in a story loop about like, oh, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? All of that kind of stuff. It was like, here are the positive things about me that these people, these elite people see in me, you know, and here's the ways that these people can help me to improve. So I really align with what you're saying there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So my last question is just about, you know, you're on the executive board for Soul Collective. You've got Coast to Coast 2 in the works. Do you have any more documentaries, any more albums, or any other things on the side that you have planned to come out in the next couple of years, couple months? What you got?
Yeah, we'll see if Coast to Coast 2 ever comes out. I don't know. I'm actually getting ready to move to Boston.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just accepted a job with 826 Boston. They really work hard to get young writers of color published, whether that's through like media journalism or their college essays, or through like creating kind of compilations of their poems and stories and writings and whole nine. So it's an amazing opportunity to work with an organization that's also like really invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They had a 17-page DEI action plan, and that to me just blew me away. When I saw that every level of the organization, how detailed a lot of that work was, I was just really impressed. And that's been something I've been looking for as a consultant, is been, is there an organization that's really taking this work to the next level? And what does it look like to transform an organization from within? So I get to like be a part of that, to witness that, and to contribute to that. So that's what I'm really excited about in terms of next steps. But as an artist, I think that there's a couple of things. One is, Wonderland just came out in January, end of January. The film just came out in March. So I've got some time to really like push that.
Yep.
And it's been interesting because I've started, understanding that I want to, roll out an album over the course of like 2 years. I think that that's been like a good amount of time. But with this project, it really feels like this could be something I do for like 4 or 5 years because of the kind of reach that I can have at the college and university level. I've done stuff with Sac State and University of San Francisco. There's a teacher's ed program, master's program at the University of San Francisco. There's the educational leadership doctorate program at Sac State. Just did something with the Harvard Graduate School Education and their hip hop program. So I think that there's legs for this project really at the university level and taking it around the country and potentially, different countries. That's been another really interesting thing. So we'll see if that happens. But musically, there's a bunch of stuff that's in the vault. I just don't know when it'll come out. I'm working with a young producer. He actually was the piano player the night that y'all came to see me play. His name is Jeffery.
Yep.
And he's working on his first album. And so we're kind of taking the approach of like a DJ Khaled, where he's like producing all the beats. He wants to work with all the artists. And I have all these relationships with really dope artists. And so we're just like piecing stuff together as we go. We're like 12 songs in right now. And we'll probably get to, 25 to 30 before we start cutting back. And just like picking out what we really like or don't like right now. So I think that's like where we're at with his stuff.
Nice.
What's his name real quick?
Jeffery Archie Jr. He goes by It's J Arch on Instagram.
We know who J Arch is. He's a trumpet player in Higher Frequency, right?
Oh.
No, so that's his cousin.
That's his cousin.
Oh.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, Joey. I was confusing the J's, but
their whole family is musical and all involved in all of the churches. Jeffrey has a regular Sunday gig at one of the local churches, and he's just an incredible player. He taught himself how to play piano by ear.
Wow.
if you play a song on the radio, and what he did even with my music was he like heard everything, and he can hear all the keys, the notes, the chord changes, and then he can tell you the specific, like it's in this key, and then it goes here to here to here, and he can
Perfect
teach
pitch.
to
Yeah.
like different, like, you know, instrument players. But he learned how to do that just because of, you know, being around his family. Music is like a second language
So
Yeah.
for them. So he's just incredible, and somebody who I want to see just be really successful, because music is really his passion. So I told him, like, you send me anything, I'm writing to it. You know, but even if it's not for me, you know, I'll find the artists that I think like would fit really well, and then you know, we'll just begin to have those conversations, and we'll go like that. So yeah, so that will come out, I think, at some point, probably next year, if we can finish just the recording process this year by December, and then just get into the mixing and mastering stuff. And but there's not like a real timeline on that just yet. So
Yeah.
we're working on that. There's a whole bunch of other young artists who I like love to support, and anytime any of them ask me to feature on something, then I will, you know. But we'll see, you know. Moving back home, maybe that'll create some more kind of artist opportunities, and maybe plans change. But for right now, I want to continue to share Wonderland and all of the stories, and all the content that was created during the process of it. You know, it was 3 years to put it together. So I feel like, you know, I should at least push it for that long.
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, some breathing room, you know.
Yeah. And then just like see what happens. You know, I think that's been the other thing I've learned as an artist is I can like set goals, but then whenever I've set goals, I've like surpassed them, and then I've been in this limbo space of like, I don't know what to do. I just accomplished everything that I wanted to do. And I was even running numbers on the album from just like the past 6 months, and everything I invested into the music side of the album, I've made back. So like I'm already like in the profit zone for the music, which is huge.
Yeah.
You know, because a lot of my favorite artists can't say that. You know, they don't own their masters, and they still owe their record label money on their albums, you know. And I don't, you know, as an independent artist, having the ability to say, oh, I own my music and I actually make money off of my music, that's a huge, huge deal.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. That's amazing. It's been so good connecting with you. Super appreciative of your time. I think the last thing I do want to make sure we get in here is connecting people with your socials, like where they can find you, you know, your name, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it's Paul Willis is hip hop. That's it's just like my name. I haven't had a cool rap name since the 6th grade, when I was hypotenuse. But yeah, Paul Willis is hip hop. That's PaulWillis and ISHIPHOP, and that's my Facebook, Instagram, Gmail, Cash App, Venmo. It's like all of my things.
Perfect.
Yeah. So if folks are you know, looking for me, that's how you can find me, and then you'll get me directly. There's no middleman, there's no manager, there's nothing like that. Like if you hit me up, I will message you back. That's a real thing.
Awesome.
Yeah, and definitely check out the music if you are interested in hip hop, conscious hip hop especially. Such a vibe, and we've super appreciated and enjoyed all the energy that you bring. So.
Yes, most
Thank
definitely.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and for the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, you too. Take it easy.